So we're looking at some criticisms of the design argument. Remember, we said that that's the way we would approach just about every topic we were going to cover. We're not going to look at the problem of evil. We're going to go to Descartes after this. But that's also covered in this PowerPoint. So we noted last time that Hume does what's also a good thing for you to do, especially if your term paper, say, is critiquing a position. That's to summarize the position you're criticizing. As I said, it does two things. It brings somebody up to speed who may be able to understand your discussion but may be unfamiliar with the particular topic you're writing on. But it also lets somebody know how you understand what you're writing on. Do you understand it? Well, so Cleanthes, as we said, is a character in the dialogue. I put these up for the 10 o'clock class. So Cleanthes is a kind of intellectual believer who wants his faith to rest on something rational, but the word Cleanthes also means somebody who views God as having human characteristics like intelligence, like the ability to show compassion and mercy. So he has Cleanthes state the design argument. So this is not Hume giving the design argument as if he believes it himself, but this is Hume getting it out to bring his readers up to speed so that he can critique it. So the world is like a machine subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines. Now, this may not seem like the argument we went over from Paley and from Aquinas, but you'll see that it is. In other words, people in Hume's day viewed the universe as a kind of clockwork mechanism, run by rigid scientific Newtonian laws. So the universe itself was looked upon as being like a giant machine, with planets and all. But there are an infinite number of smaller machines. That is, things that have a mechanism, like ears and eyes, the parts of plants and animals down here. And their parts, as Paley argued, are admirably and accurately adjusted to one another. That is, they're coordinated. Everybody needs to make sure you get down on the roll. And throughout nature, then, he says, means are adapted to ends in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design. So just as the parts of a machine like a watch are coordinated to fulfill some purpose or end or function, so also things in nature, as Paley pointed out, seem to have parts that work together to enable that little machine to perform its function, whether it's the machine of the eye enabling us to see or the machine of the ear enabling us to hear. So this is, by almost everyone, understood to be an argument from analogy. Now, I read something on the internet recently where a recent writer was trying to go against 200 years of tradition in saying that it's not an analogy. Well, I couldn't understand why they thought it wasn't. but it certainly is a situation where the onus of proof is on the person who's the odd man out. In other words, who's going against 200 years of tradition. The burden of proof is on them to show it's not an analogy, and I don't think they show that it wasn't. So the effects, the products of design, resemble each other. In other words, this is how the analogy goes. So by analogy, the causes, the designers behind those products must also resemble one another. In order to design something, we need an intelligence, a mind, right, capable of designing something like a watch or a house. So it says that if we need that to design something, the author of nature, God, must have a mind, an intelligence that's like a human mind. Only, the argument goes on, since the works of nature are so much more complex and intricate than the works of a human being, than something like a watch, then from that we can conclude that God, as the author of nature, has a much more complex and sophisticated mind than ours. God has larger faculties. Since the products of divine design, like ears and eyes and brains, are grander than the products of human design. So, to sum up, the conclusion of the design argument is that not only that God exists, but that God has an intelligence, a mind similar to our own, if not a lot more sophisticated. Now, Damia, the other character in the dialogue, who's kind of a very simple, straightforward, person of simple faith, he doesn't like Cleanthes' design argument because it's an a posteriori argument. That is, it's an argument that depends on observations from nature and on a similarity of the deity to men. And so it's only a probabilistic argument. Now, Damia would prefer to see a necessary a priori argument, like a mathematical argument, a demonstration in geometry. In a deductive argument, it is a contradiction to assume that the premises, the reasons given as evidential support for the conclusion, that the premises are true while the conclusion is false. In other words, if the premises of a deductive argument, like an argument in geometry, or like the analogical argument, are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. That is, the truth of the premises absolutely, with necessity, guarantees the truth of the conclusion in that type of an a priori deductive argument. Now, the design argument is not that way. It's only a probable argument. In other words, at most, it would simply say that there's a probability. And for defenders of the design argument, a decent probability that there was a designer of the world. But even in an argument where there's a high probability, it does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. We just had the hurricane. Hurricane Hugo was also a Category 4 that hit Charleston, South Carolina with 140-mile-an-hour winds. I saw the aftermath of that storm 6 months later. I think I told you about that. 100-foot-tall pine trees along 70 miles of road bent like broken like matchsticks by the storm. Well, at any rate, they thought that hurricane was, after hitting Charlotte, North Carolina, was going to come right up the Route 29 I-95 corridor, hit us in Charlottesville, where I was going to the University of Virginia at the time, then go right up the corridor and hit Washington and Baltimore. You say, well, I don't recall Hugo hitting Baltimore, or my parents even talking about that. This was in the early 80s. No, it didn't. A system caught it to the south and threw it into the mountains, and it went by for us in Charlottesville on the other side of the mountains. However, because the weather people thought that that hurricane was going to come right up Charlottesville's way, we had a prediction with a 100% chance of rain. So I saw a 100% chance of rain not come through. First time I've seen that. Well, so even if there's a high probability, it's still possible in what's called a probabilistic or inductive argument for all the premises to be true, but yet the conclusion to be false. It was false that it rained in Charlottesville. So, but Philo, the skeptic, which is Hume, remember, he says, you know what, that's not my problem with the argument from design. He says, my problem is not that it's a probabilistic argument, but he says, I don't think it's a good probabilistic argument. See, probabilistic arguments run the gamut from good ones to bad ones. And Hume, the more mature Hume, is willing to accept that some probabilistic arguments can be good. I was watching cable at a friend's house, and they had a show where people were prospecting for gems out west. And these guys are digging, right? And they had this big rock above where they're digging. And they're afraid that the thing's going to come loose and roll down on them. Why? Because they know that when rocks come loose, they roll downhill, right? They've seen that many, many times before, right? You all know that if you drop a book on your foot, it's going to hurt. You know, it's going to go down, right? Because you've seen what happens when you drop something. It hits the floor. So Hume says there are objects that, he objects that the design argument isn't as strong as other probable arguments where we have a lot of cases to compare, right? That a stone will fall, that a fire will burn, you know, not to put your finger under a match if you've lit it, that the earth is solid. He says we've got all kinds of cases that make us confident, right, that fire is going to burn next time. He says these are based on thousands of observations, and not only that, but observations of exactly similar cases, and so we can predict a similar event, right? I mean, if you have a dry match, you're pretty doggone confident that if you strike it, it's going to light. Why? Because you've seen it happen hundreds of times before if you've lit a match. So the exact similarity of the cases assures us that we can conclude that the same thing's going to happen in the future. But he says, for one, we don't have multiple cases of design to go on, right? There's an old joke among professors, oh, I'm going to give them this really bare of a final, with one question. Describe the universe and give 2 examples, right? Now you'd write your hand off for 2 hours on that one, right? Well, I mean, that's a humorous way of making Hume's point. We only have one example of a universe. It isn't like we have multiple examples of the universe and say, well, here's the universe A, and here's universe B, and universe C, and we know all those universes had a designer, so our universe must have a designer. Well, Hume says, we only got one to go on, this one, right? So he says the design argument might be a weak analogy since we have only one case to go on. But also, he says, we might not be comparing similar things when we try to compare the universe to a created and designed product, like a watch or, in Hume's case, a house. Now, Hume assumes that a lot of his readers need to be brought up to speed logically on what an argument from analogy is and what makes a good one versus a bad one. And so he says, the farther you get away in similarity from the things you're comparing in an argument from analogy, the weaker is the argument, the less evidence that the argument gives for its conclusion. And so he's going to try to say that the design argument is a weak argument from analogy. And so he tries to give people who are reading his book a little logic lesson in arguments from analogy to illustrate this point. He says if we depart from the similarity of the cases we're comparing, the evidence that the argument gives for its conclusion diminishes proportionally. And he says, take an example of the circulation of blood, right? If we're talking about comparing the circulation of blood in exactly similar things like 2 human beings, he said it's beyond doubt to conclude that blood circulates in other human beings from observing what human blood does in a human being. But he says even if we get away from exact similarity, he says it's only a presumption, but a good one, to conclude that human blood circulation is like that we find in things like frogs and fishes. Now, it's not always good to compare what happens in our own metabolism and anatomy with what happens in a lab animal, like a rat or a rabbit, right? You've been told, I mean, you might be a chocoholic, like your professor, right? Love chocolate, but you've been told don't give chocolate to your dog because it doesn't, it can be poison to their system. And this happens when they're developing a new drug, right? It might be that they've got a new drug for a type of cancer or a new HIV drug or something, and it's working well in lab rats or in rabbits. But what has to happen before any new drug gets approval? Well, they have to do more than say, this thing's worked in a rat, so give me approval to put this on the market for human beings. No. They say, look, okay, you've got some initial evidence that the drug does what you say it's going to do, but before we approve it, the Food and Drug Administration will say, look, you need to do some clinical trials on human beings. So we see how the drug actually works on human beings before we're willing to write off on it and let you market it. You have to do clinical trials. But on something like the circulation of blood, though, we can still conclude that since fish and frogs are animals, that blood circulates in them as it does in us, you know. Now, Hume says, what if we get very far away in the things we're comparing? What if we talk about looking at vegetables? I don't know if you've ever, you know, maybe you've been cutting down weeds with a sickle or something, or you just broke one open, you see little tubules, you know, and you know that sap goes in tubules and things like tree trunks. And he says, you know, okay, blood travels in blood vessels, and there are little tubules in vegetables. So there's a similarity. So sap in plants and trees must circulate like it does in animals. Hume says that would be a wrong conclusion. We know what happens this time of the year. See, I was awake. Actually, I like biology, general biology. I was forced to take a year of it, but I didn't mind. So in the leaves, right, if you're taking biology, you got what? You got chlorophyll, which turns the leaves green, xanthophyll, and carotene. Carotene, from which we get the word carrot, is what gives the leaves their orange color, xanthophyll the yellow color, right? What happens this time of the year? The sap and the chlorophyll goes down into the roots of the tree for the winter, and what's left is the xanthophyll and the carotene that turns the leaves yellow and orange. In other words, the sap does not circulate. It goes down to the roots in the winter, and it's going to come back up in the spring, but it's not always going around. So Hume would say, you can be led even to a wrong, false conclusion by a bad analogy. And of course, you got to read between the lines, right? As a skeptic, isn't he saying, hey, look, if the design argument is a bad analogy, maybe you'd be led into a wrong conclusion like that God exists from the design argument. So he says when you got similar effects, you have similar causes. Now, I inherited an old house in Baltimore. It's an old house like some of the ones in this block. The records go back to 1900. Why do the records go back to an even date like 1900? Because all the records for old houses like that were lost in the Great Baltimore Fire when a lot of downtown burned down. I think it's something like 1905 or something like that. Right? But I don't have any doubt that my house was designed and built by somebody. It didn't just grow there, right? Even though I've never seen it. I wasn't around in 1900. Really, I wasn't. I mean, you know, maybe hard to convince some of you of that, but take my word for it, I wasn't. Right? You know, I mean, they're building an apartment complex right across the street from me. So, on seeing a house, Hume says, we conclude with great certainty that it had a builder. He says, why? Because all houses we've observed in the past have had builders, so this one must have had one too. But here's where Hume's going with this. He's saying, what about something that's dissimilar? He says, here, the universe and a house. The presumption of a similar cause might be just a guess, a conjecture, a presumption. Now, also, he says, look, if we have order in the universe, one possible cause of that order is deliberate design. However, that's not the only way that you can get order. Right? So Philo and Cleanthes agree then that order would only be proof of design if experience showed that things like order, arrangement, adjustment to final causes proceeded from it. A priori, the above could be caused by something internal to matter itself. Now, Hume is writing in probably the 1770s. His book came out after his death. He died in the year of our nation's birth, 1776, probably of stomach cancer. When Hume was a young man, I think I mentioned this before, he wrote a book called The Treatise of Human Nature, and he wanted that book to put him on the intellectual map. He wanted to really get a firestorm of criticism from the skeptical views he had in that book. And he said the book fell stillborn from the presses. Nobody paid any attention to it. Nobody knew who he was. But exactly the opposite is true from the book from which these selections come from. Hume wrote the dialogues concerning natural religion. And remember, the title of Paley's work is Natural Theology. This is the area of philosophy and philosophy of religion that says, well, could we get any evidence from God just from nature, apart from any revelation? Well, at any rate, at the end of his life, Hume has a vast literary reputation. He is known internationally. He's also written something like a 10-volume history of England. I forget what it was, 10 or 12. That was the standard history of England for years. That's because he couldn't get a university job and he worked in a library and put his time to good use researching that history of England. Hume doesn't want to be bothered with criticisms this late in his life. So he left instructions that this book not be published till after his death. But still, Hume's writing in the 1770s. Darwin comes along in the 1840s. Paley wrote in 1802 and read Hume. I think more recently scholars have proven that. There was some doubt as to whether Paley even knew about Hume, but he did. But at any rate, at this stage of the game then, Hume only speculates about this logically. Darwin tries to fill in a more complete story. So Hume says, well, what if in matter itself there were a principle that tended toward order as well as that which might come from an external source? He says the elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal material cause. Right? And Hume says, now remember, these pages were from a different text, not your own. Page 153 is not going to refer to your book. Hume says it's as easy to conceive of this as that the divine mind is the source of the order and arrangement in the universe. So Hume's saying that there are other possible conclusions. And this is basically Darwin's story. Now, your book talks about the fact that Darwinian evolution can be reconciled with design by an intelligent God. There are ways to do that. It's called theistic evolution. In other words, where God uses development over thousands, if not millions of years, and uses adaptation and natural selection as tools in the development and the ultimate design of more advanced life forms. You can get out a story and you know, so evolutionary theory is not necessarily incompatible with, you know, belief in a God who designed the universe. Now, if you're talking the young Earth, it gets a little more complicated. If you're saying the universe is 6,000 years old, that's a little more complicated. You don't necessarily have to presuppose that to accept Genesis 1, but I'm not going to go into that now. But at any rate, but Darwin's original story, though, was that evolution was an entirely random natural process directed toward no goal or end in particular, and certainly not directed toward producing us. And so the idea is that you would have mutations, adaptations that would come about along the way, and that would give new members of the species with that adaptation a leg up in the struggle for survival, whether it be a longer neck for a giraffe or a faster wolf or something. And so eventually, you know, the members of the species without that adaptation would die out, and the more positive members would be preserved, just as a process of randomness and natural selection. And so the evolutionists, and you all probably know this from biology, right? The evolutionary story about how something like the eye came about is that it wasn't designed and built like a watch or like a house, but that over millions of years and a lot of positive adaptations and members with better eyes, say, surviving, while members of the species with lesser eyes died out, you would get, over the course of time, you know, members and animals developing with more and more complex eyes till you finally get to us. But as I say, original Darwinism views this as a totally random statistical process. Now, you know, like I really need another tug on my time. I got backgammon tonight. We use precision dice, you know, at the higher tournament levels. Why? Because the random rolls that you get with a pair of precision dice are closer to what the laws of probability on which your strategy is based say you're going to get. And in other words, dice where things are cut out are not weighted the same. They don't give you. So at any rate, if you shake up a pair of precision dice and say you throw them and you get a 6 and a 1, right? That's a random event. That's a random process. Shaking the dice, throwing them. Well, you know, if you run that random process again, chances are you're not going to get another 6 and a 1. You might get a 5 and a 3. You might get 2 4s or something entirely different. Well, this is the story of Darwinian evolution, and a more recent evolutionist has brought this out. He says, look, if we ran this whole random process over again, there's no guarantee whatsoever that it would produce us or anything like us. That we came along with simply the result of a series of happy accidents. Now, of course, this has significant implications for who and what we are. But like I say, I mean, you can put God back into the evolutionary process so that it was designed with us as the end. But the original Darwinian view was that it was an entirely random natural process that produced us as a matter of happy accidents along the way. Well, so Hume makes this point again when, remember, he's a non-scientist, but he knows something about the science of his day, right? He's a very educated man. He's got background knowledge on principles like heat and cold from chemistry, attraction and repulsion, and magnetism. And Hume says nature has a lot of causal principles, and design is only one of them. That is deliberate, when something is deliberately designed and built with parts that serve a certain end, right? He says some things in nature affect others by design, but he says it would be illegitimate to reason that all of them do, that everything in nature is a product of design. It would be wrong reasoning from part to whole. It would be like drawing conclusions about the generation of a human being from that of a hair. Of course, we know that from a hair you can get DNA, but at any rate, so this is Hume writing maybe 60, 70 years before Darwin, but speculating along the same lines, that maybe we can try to account for the complexity of things in nature in a way that refers to nothing but natural forces, which was what Darwin did in his original argument. Now, Cleanthes responds with a response that's very similar to what we've just seen in Paley. He says the eye has a structure that implies a contriver or a designer. That it is the product of design, he says, is the most obvious conclusion. Frivolous, abstruse arguments of the skeptic against design are less easily arrived at and less obvious. Well, again, what is the most obvious? Here's a case. I stopped with the other class here, so I think this is a good place to stop, and we'll end this next time. Wednesday, I'm hoping we can go over the test. I may not have all the essays done by then, I just have to say. I mean, you know, I'm working on you all. I've finished all my Essex classes, but still. At any rate, to get back to this, what is most obvious? Well, to a naturalist, they might say, well, I believe in Occam's razor, in the principle that says the simplest explanation for what is happening is more than likely the right one and the best one. And it complicates things unnecessarily to bring a supreme being into the mix, you know. So I think we need a totally naturalistic explanation for how things developed, you know. So it's less obvious to me that there's a designer than that there's a totally natural process. But on the other side of the coin, my problem dates back to a book I read when I was in high school. Not by an evangelical Christian by any means, but by a scientist who believed in God, who gave an argument on how unlikely it is that you can even get one strand of DNA by an entirely random process. And the odds against it are enormous. And, you know, it's like once you get replication going and adaptation in more complex organisms, you can tell the evolutionary story pretty well. But my intellectual problem is, how do you get the first strand of DNA? You know, okay, once you got the whole rest of it going, yeah, I can follow your argument, just like Darwin. But how do you get it to begin with? You know, leaving a designer out of the picture. You know, to me, it's less obvious that that's a random process. You know, but as I said, we're going to let you be autonomous and decide who you think has the better case. The naturalist who wants to explain everything as an entirely natural process, or, you know, somebody who wants to bring in the agency of God. So we're going to pick this up next time with this slide. You know, make sure you get, especially if you're an athlete. I'm getting a lot of pressure to get reports for athletes now. Make sure you get your name down on that roll. If it's not on that roll, you know, I don't remember who was here from day to day, much less 3 weeks ago. If your name's not on that roll, as far as I'm concerned, you weren't here today, you know? So don't come back and say, oh, but I was here. Well, you know, is your name on the roll? No, you weren't here as far as I'm concerned. So, okay, so it's floating around somewhere. So we'll see. I'm going to try my best to enable us to go over the test on Wednesday. By the end of the week, I need to get a midterm grade in for you. Midterm is a misnomer, folks. We've only got 25% of the whole semester stuff in, you know, but the college calls it, the university calls it a midterm grade. Ethics calls it a progress report, and that's a better way to name it. You know, there's going to be plenty. That's from the previous class. You don't want it that. You know, somebody. Okay, this is the one to get your name down on. If you're, yeah, there's a pen. Okay.